There's a certain kind of sound that doesn't really belong to a specific year or even a specific place. It's not polished enough to sit comfortably on mainstream radio, and it's not chaotic enough to be dismissed as noise. It lives somewhere in between, restless, melodic, a little bit frayed at the edges. There's a lot of bands like that. It's the kind of sound that feels like it was made not for an audience, but because it had to be made. That music just had to be. And if you've ever spent time digging through the DNA of American indie rock, you probably crossed paths with that sound at some point. Because in many ways, that sound leads right back to Superchunk. Now, to really understand Superchunk, you have to go back to the late 80s, to a college town that didn't always get the same spotlight as some of its other southern counterparts, but quietly built one of the most important underground music communities in the country. We're talking about Chapel Hill, North Carolina, home of the UNC Tar Heels. This wasn't a scene built on hype or industry attention. It was built on proximity, on friendships, on people seeing each other play in cramped rooms night after night and thinking, I want to be part of that. It was a place where bands didn't wait for permission, and they just plugged in and figured it out as they went along. Now, at the center of Superchunk were two people whose relationship would end up shaping not just the band, but an entire corner of indie music. We're talking about Matt McCaughan and Laura Balance. They weren't just bandmates, they were partners, creatively and personally. And that kind of closeness has a way of just showing up in the music, whether you intend it to or not. Alongside them were guitarist Jack McCook and drummer Chuck Garrison. That was the original lineup. They ended up, having different players come and go, but that was where they started. And it was a lineup that felt less like a calculated unit and more like a group of people just trying to channel something urgent before it slipped away. And urgency is really the word that defines Superchunk's early sound. Their self-titled debut album, Superchunk, in 1990, it didn't feel like a carefully constructed introduction. It felt like you just walked into a room mid-song, guitars buzzing, drums pushing forward, vocals that sounded like they were being pulled out in real time rather than carefully delivered. There was a looseness to it, but not in a lazy way, in a way that it made everything feel alive, like in the moment. Like it could just tip over at any second, and somehow that tension is exactly what keeps it together. Songs like Slack Mother Effer, although they actually sing it, became an underground anthem, not just because they were engineered to be catchy, but because they captured something honest and unfiltered. There's a difference between a band trying to sound raw and a band that just is raw. Superchunk fell firmly into that second category, and that authenticity made people pay attention, even if they didn't fully realize why at first. Well, then came their follow-up, No Pocky for Kitty. I don't know what it means. I prefer not knowing, as the saying goes. And with it, a subtle but important shift. Working with producer Steve Albini, he produced Pixies and Nirvana. I mean, he was a big-time producer. The band's sound tightened up without losing its edge, and that was key. The guitars hit a little harder, the rhythm section locked in just a little more, but it just still felt like Superchunk, still immediate, a little unpredictable, still driven by that same restless energy. Now, if the debut was a burst of expression, No Pocky for Kitty felt like the band realizing just how powerful that expression could be when it was sharpened, even ever so slightly. But the real turning point, the moment where Superchunk became something deeper than just a great indie rock band, came with 1994's Foolish, because this wasn't just an album, it was a document of a relationship falling apart in real time, much like Fleetwood Mac's Rumors. This has all those same hallmarks. Mac McCaughan and Laura Balance were going through a breakup, and instead of stepping away from the band, they leaned into the music. The result is something that feels almost uncomfortably honest. It almost feels like when you listen to it, you're intruding on something, and I love that. It's not in a dramatic, over-the-top way, but in a quiet, observational way that somehow hits even harder. It's a good record. When you listen to Foolish, there's this sense that you're just hearing conversations that weren't necessarily meant for you. Again, like you're intruding. Songs like Driveway to Driveway, they don't just tell a story, they sit with it for a while. There's space in them, reflection, a kind of emotional weight that doesn't resolve neatly by the end of the track, and that's cool. And that's part of what makes the album so enduring. It doesn't try to clean up the messiness of real life. It just lets it exist like it is. And that's incredible to pull that off. At the same time that Superchunk was evolving musically, something else was quietly taking shape behind the scenes, something that would end up having an even wider impact on indie music as a whole. And that something was Merge Records. Now, Merge Records was started by Mac and Laura almost as an extension of their DEY philosophy. Merge began just as a way to release music on their own terms. No gatekeepers, no suits, no waiting around for approval. Just make the record, press it, and get it into people's hands however you can, as quickly as you can. Now, over time, Merge grew into one of the most respected independent labels in the world, helping bring artists like Neutral Milk Hotel and Arcade Fire to wider audiences. But even as it expanded, it never lost that core identity. It still felt like something built by people who cared more about the music than the machinery around it. And that ethos is inseparable from Superchunk itself. The band wasn't just part of the indie rock movement, they were actually actively helping build the infrastructure that allowed it to exist. As the 1990s moved forward, Superchunk continued to evolve without ever completely shredding their original identity. Albums like Here's Where the Strings Come In and Indoor Living showed a band that was willing to explore new textures and structures. The songs became a little more refined, a little more layered, but never to the point where they felt overproduced. And that makes sense. I mean, once you get better at something, you should sound better because of it. There was always that underlying sense of momentum, that feeling that the music was still being pushed forward rather than carefully placed. And then as the decade came to a close and the music industry began to shift, Superchunk did something that not every band knows how to do. They stepped back for a while, not dramatically, not with a big farewell, but just a gradual slowing down. A recognition that maybe it was time to pause, maybe recalibrate, let things kind of play out and breathe for a while. Now, during that period, though, Mac McCon explored a different creative outlet that I liked a lot, and this is his project Portastatic. Now, where Superchunk was immediate and often explosive, Portastatic leaned more into introspective, sometimes experimental spaces. It allowed Mac to stretch as a songwriter to explore sounds and structures that didn't necessarily fit within the Superchunk framework. And in a way, that exploration helped preserve Superchunk's identity. So instead of forcing the band to become something it wasn't, he created a parallel path, like an alternate universe type thing. I thought that was really neat. I got to see them a couple times in concert. The records are amazing. I only had like 2.5, I think, but yeah, they were really good. So when Superchunk returned in 2010 with Majesty Shredding, which is amazing, it didn't feel like a reunion built on nostalgia, it just felt like a continuation. The energy was still there, the melodies were still sharp. If anything, there was a renewed sense of purpose. A reminder that this band wasn't a band defined by a single era. They weren't just revisiting the past, they were still actively part of the present. Now that continued with later releases like I Hate Music and What a Time to Be Alive, records that showed a band unafraid to engage with the world around them while still holding on to the core elements that made them who they were. There's a confidence in those albums, but it's not the kind of thing that comes from chasing trends. It's the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you do and doing it well. I Hate Music, if all you do is listen to the song Me and You and Jackie Matu, you're living good. That's a great song. That's a great album, the whole thing. And so maybe that's the key to understanding Superchunk's legacy. They were never the biggest band in the room. They were never going to be the most polished or the most commercially successful ever, but they were consistent in a way that goes deeper than chart positions or headlines, and that's true. They stayed true to a certain idea of what a band could be, independent not just in name, but in practice. Emotional without being performative, loud without losing melody, raw without losing intention. They helped define a path that countless bands would follow, not by selling out or setting out to be influential, but simply by doing things their own way and sticking to it. And through Merge Records, they extended that influence far beyond their own music. helping to create a space where other artists could do the same. So when you think about Superchunk, it's not just about the songs or the albums or even the era they came from. It's about a mindset. It's a way of approaching music that values honesty over perfection, energy over precision, and connection over scale. They try to make a connection with their audience, and every time I saw them or listened to them, it's always the same. It's about the idea that you don't need to wait for the world to catch up to you. You just need to make something real and trust that it'll find its way to the people who need it. I think that's really cool. And maybe that's why even now, decades later, Superchunk doesn't feel like a band that belongs to the past. They still feel immediate. They still feel relevant. They still feel like something you could stumble onto on a random night and walk away from changed, even if just a little bit. I mean, their latest album, Songs in the Key of Yikes, it's just as good as anything they've ever done. And that's really neat. Because, some sounds, they fade over time, but some sounds, they just keep ringing. And that's what Superchunk has always meant to me. They were never in my top 10 favorites ever, but I've never listened to them and thought, it's not good. They've always been good. So here's where I turn it over to you. Any of you guys ever see them in person? I did a couple of times, more than a couple, and it was always a trip. I mean, they were intense. Do you have a favorite record? I'm partial to I Hate Music, but I'd love to hear your favorite. Where do you think they fall in the all-time college rock list? I think a little bit underrated, but I also think a little bit underexposed for the most part. So that might be why. Underexposed, underpromoted. I'm interested to know what you think. That'd be really interesting to find out. So until next time, always look up, because that's where the answers are. We're all going to make it, I promise. But you guys take care, and I'll see you on the next one.